So, hello and welcome to Quo vadis China, a podcast organized by the Eastern Europe Study Center. I am Raigirdas Boruta, an associate expert for China Research Program. Since the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia's closest partners' actions and statements were extremely closely observed with the hope of finding some hints about China's changes in its position. However, since the beginning, China has maintained its pro-Putin neutrality and refrained from openly condemning Russia. Amidst international sanctions and isolation, China proved to be a significant lifeline for faltering Russia's economy. The topic for today's podcast revolves around Ukraine and China, dynamics of their bilateral relations, China's potential role as a peacemaker, and its place in the Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. I'm delighted to have as my guest today Yurii Poita, who is the head of the Asia-Pacific section at the Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies based in Kyiv, Ukraine. Mr. Poita's research interests include China's influence in the post-Soviet space, hybrid threats to national security, and Ukrainian-Chinese relations. And just as me, he's currently a Taiwanese fellow conducting his research on a topic, the Russian-Ukraine war, the role of China and the consequences for China's further foreign policy at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research. Welcome, Yurii.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure and great honor to share my ideas and insights.
Oh, thank you. First of all, I think that since the beginning of invasion last year, the analysts were really preoccupied with scrutinizing the Sino-Russian ties. But I got an impression that there is some kind of lack of understanding when it comes to the dynamics of the Sino-Ukrainian ties, which is also a very interesting topic to look at from both the historical and the current perspective. So could you please provide us with a short background of the China-Ukraine bilateral relationship dynamics in the last decade? And are there any similarities in terms of Ukraine's experience with China as compared to what used to be a 17+1 cooperation format between China and the Central and Eastern Europe?
So first of all, I have to say that Ukraine has, I would say, long-term relation with China, and we call it strategic partnership. So Ukraine officially recognized its relation with China as a strategic relation since 2011, and because it was signed, the huge amount of documents during the state visit between our two leaders. And in 2013, it was another package of documents that was signed also in Beijing that also recognized our relation as a strategic partnership. Moreover, in 2019, China became the first trade partner of Ukraine, and it was about 15% of Ukrainian trade and about 15% of Ukrainian export went to China. So for Ukraine, cooperation with Chinese was significant first of all, from trade perspective. At the same time, Ukraine perceived China as not only as a trade partner, but also as a potential driver for developing its economy, especially when it comes to added value, when it comes to industrialization, to new technology, building industrial parks, improving infrastructure, etc. So Ukraine always invited Chinese investment to Ukraine and to make economy better, to make economy more competitive. But at the same time, it didn't come true. So Chinese investment in Ukraine economy less than 1% of overall investment. So it was kind of a huge disappointment of Ukrainian government, Ukrainian leadership, and Ukraine that China didn't invest in Ukraine as promised. So basically, China used Ukraine as a source of raw materials and also agricultural products. So basically, Ukrainian export to China was based only on low added value products. So it wasn't significant in terms of developing economy. It wasn't significant in terms of making economy, more robust, more competitive on the international market, etc. Another dimension of Ukraine-Chinese relations that also gave kind of the impression of strategic relation was a military technical cooperation. So Ukraine had a huge defense cooperation with China and actually helped Chinese to build up its navy, its missile system, its aircraft, etc. In different spheres, the cooperation was very huge. It was about, if I'm not mistaken, up to 90 million US dollars annually that Ukraine exported to China in terms of military and defense cooperation. But at the same time, this military technical cooperation was only one-sided. So Ukraine wasn't able to reverse this cooperation in favorable to Ukraine direction. I mean that Ukraine only sold to China military technology, military equipment, some weapons, etc., but wasn't able to get from China what Ukraine actually needed. For instance, air defense, missile defense, aircrafts, fighters, etc. So it was also kind of lesson learned from Ukraine-Chinese cooperations that China got from Ukraine what China wanted, but Ukraine wasn't able to make this cooperation favorable for its defense. And another illusion that Ukraine had was that cooperation with Chinese would build up security guarantees for Ukraine. For instance, if you have very much trade, if you have very many investors, Chinese companies in Ukraine, and you have robust military technical cooperation, at some point China could be kind of security guarantee, could play a constructive role in terms of Ukraine national interest, especially when it comes to the struggle with Ukraine and Russia. But it also didn't come true. So after 2014, after a revolution of dignity, trade cooperation developed, but at the same time, the dialogue on the highest level between presidents, between prime ministers, was kind of frozen. So there wasn't any state visit to China from Ukrainian side and vice versa. So president of Ukraine and Chinese leader, they met each other, but only during some international events, for instance, in the United Nations, etc. And also another disappointment of Ukrainian side was Chinese position in the United Nations in terms of Russian-Ukraine war. So China always voted against Ukrainian resolution in United Nations General Assembly, or China was abstained from supporting this resolution. So to conclude, what was so the first trade partner, the promising investor, but it didn't come true, and also this military technical cooperation, but defense wasn't turned to Ukrainian national interest. If we look at the situation after full-scale invasion, Ukraine also had a huge amount of illusion of positive, so-called positive Chinese role in resolving conflict. Ukraine had about maybe seven main goals that Kyiv wanted to achieve from Chinese side. For instance, Kyiv believes that China would put pressure on Russia, or China would be a security guarantor for Ukrainian national security, or China could help Ukraine in another way, or something like that. But results and achievement from China was very much limited. So now what we see now, so the perception of China in Ukraine changed a lot, actually. So expert community, journalists are very much critical towards China. And this criticism also spread it to the parliament. And in Ukrainian parliament, very many MPs, they are kind of very pessimistic and very critical in terms of Chinese so-called, as you mentioned, pro-Russian neutrality. And this dialogue and this discussion that Ukraine shouldn't recognize China as a strategic partner and should recognize China only as an economic partner with limited cooperation with some spheres. This dialogue also, as I see, transferred to the government, and now I see some indicators that government also tries to find out a new model, new formula how to deal with China. Also taking into account the Ukraine's how to say intentions to join NATO and to join European Union, because we look, for instance, at the NATO's approach, NATO's strategy on China, that China is a challenge to national security, interest, and values of NATO. And if Ukraine wants to join NATO, it is, it's necessary for Kyiv to also to share the same values, the same approach, etc. So now this dialogue, this discussion is very active in Ukraine government, and I do believe that Ukraine gradually will implement the approach that is now implemented in European Union and NATO.
And another big topic within the global community is China's potential role in a peace settlement between Ukraine and Russia. Since the invasion last year, expectations towards China and its ability to influence Russia were quite high, I would say, judging from the international media, and every move and word was scrutinized in search for some deeper meanings and hints of some changes within China's attitude. Sometimes later, given no changes in China's position, the pessimism grew. However, recently, China has become a bit more active, I would say, and mostly diplomatically. So we have this, for example, Xi Zelensky call that resulted in China's special envoy Li Hui's visit. And in a recent interview with Al Jazeera, when Fu Song, who is China's ambassador to the European Union, was asked about supporting Kyiv's goals, which includes reclaiming other Ukrainian regions now occupied by Russia, the senior Chinese diplomat said, I don't see why not. It could be interpreted as an important development in the Chinese diplomatic rhetoric, as China's officials typically refrain from making public comments on Russia's annexation. So to what extent are these seemingly positive signals? And is China beginning to play a more constructive role in the recent times? Or perhaps such diplomatic activeness is especially tailored to a very specific audience, be it domestic or maybe European or global South audiences?
Actually, Ukraine see very pessimistic situation on positive or so-called constructive Chinese role and this diplomatic attempts to achieve a peace settlement, etc. So from the 24th of February, so China had so-called pro-China neutrality. This position means that that China always stated that Beijing respect Ukrainian territorial integrity, sovereignty, etc. But China never criticized Russia for its invasion, never criticized Russia for its war crimes and for its actions. And also, China always blamed US and NATO for so-called Ukrainian crisis. And China always criticized, and now is being criticizing, providing Ukraine with weapons from the West. And China always states that that US and NATO put oil, so-called put oil to the fire, and it will not change the situation. It will not make any difference, and Ukraine should find an agreement, should make some concession with Russia, and should respect Russian so-called rational security concerns. And China always criticized sanctions imposed against Russia, also saying that they don't solve problems, they will slow global economy, etc. So from Ukrainian perspective, Chinese position is not for Ukrainian national interest. And as you mentioned, actually, this new development when phone call between Zelensky and Xi Jinping finally was conducted in spring this year, and also after China published so-called peace plan or Chinese position on so-called Ukrainian crisis. So it seems that China changed a little bit its position and tried to play more active role, a diplomatic role. But from Ukrainian perspective, it also was seen kind of negatively. and I will try to explain why. Because this Chinese attempts to conduct so-called peace negotiation without withdrawing Russian territory from Ukrainian Russian troops from Ukrainian territory means freezing conflict. So it is completely against the Ukrainian national interest, because if Russia maintain its position on the occupied Ukrainian territory, even if whatever so-called peace negotiation will be conducted, but Russia never withdraw its armed forces from Ukrainian territory. So for Ukraine, it is absolutely incredible military threat, because Russia will be able to maintain its position on the Ukrainian territory and rebuild its armed forces, and in 1 year or in 2 years continue its military operation against Ukraine. So this Chinese attempts to conduct so-called peace negotiation between Ukraine and Russia, perceived in Kyiv as an attempt to freeze situation on the battlefield, and especially before Ukrainian counteroffensive that Ukraine prepared for a long time for it and already started this counteroffensive. So it perceived in Ukraine as an attempt of China to disrupt Ukrainian counteroffensive and to make so-called peace favorable for Russia. But what it could lead to, it actually could lead to the Ukrainian defeat, Ukrainian failure, because it will give an opportunity to Russia to obtain the so-called operational pause and to rebuild its military and to lift some sanction, etc. So, and interestingly enough, during the visit of special representative of China to Ukraine, Li Hui, what Ukraine also tried to achieve. So Ukraine understood that China will not change its position generally, but maybe some tiny elements, some elements and achievement could be done. For instance, Ukraine draw its attention to three points. The first one is nuclear security. The second one is grain corridor, and the third one is helping of China to return Ukrainian children, about 20,000 Ukrainian children that was forcibly deported from Ukraine to Russia. And Ukraine tried to ask China to help with these 3 points on nuclear security, because Ukraine power plant Zaporizhzhia is under Russian occupation, and then China actually is the main beneficiary of Ukrainian export of grain, of this grain corridor. So Kyiv believes that it could invoke China to help Ukraine, to help international community to maintain this so-called grain corridor in the Black Sea. But it actually failed. So nothing. We don't see any practical steps of China in terms of resolving this conflict, in terms of helping Ukraine. So for the time being, Ukraine perceived China kind of not, and Chinese position not only kind of not favorable for Ukraine, but also against, in some points, very much against Ukrainian state, Ukrainian nation, and Ukrainian security interest. So basically, I don't see this development of Chinese diplomacy from the positive, from the optimistic position, and I think that Ukrainian government share my position.
And why, in your opinion, do some countries in the West still hold some, I would say, unrealistic expectation with regards to China's ability and willingness to pressure on Russia? Because we still have, some statements from some Western countries that are trying to maintain some kind of dialogue with China with regards to war in Ukraine. So what do you think? Where does this holding of expectations come from? And given more than ever strong economic and other ties between China and Russia, so why do some countries still hold these expectations with regards to China?
Actually, I don't think that these countries have very much expectation. So I see this discussions, this dialogue, etc. But I also see that in expert community and also in some politicians. So the belief and expectation, as you mentioned, that all about Chinese so-called positive role is very much tiny. But what was the reason that Europe had this expectation? I think that first of all, this Chinese very active work on diplomatic level and also in information space. So China perceives itself as and try to portray itself as a kind of mediator and so peacekeeper, etc. And China always said that China against this war, against this crisis, etc. And for European Union, for Europe, it was kind of element that and it was kind of believed that war is against Chinese national interest. It means that China could help to resolve it. Another thing is that China has a huge leverage on Russian economy. The dependence of Russia on China is increasing very much. So actually, China has this opportunity to put pressure on Russia, and but we don't see even kind of clear statement of Chinese leadership that China criticized Russian action in Ukraine and call for withdrawing armed forces for Ukraine. So what we can expect, practically, if China cannot even, make clear statement. And also, I think that the reason why Europe has this illusion is that lack of understanding maybe the global Chinese strategy, what China wants in the world, and what position and what role of Russia in this Chinese global strategy in the world. So because when we talk with Chinese experts, they always insisted that Russia is very much important for China in its competition, strategic competition with the United States. And China will not, never drop Russia and won't do any actions that could spoil their relation. So I see that it is. I think that it is illusion, very huge illusion on Chinese so-called positive constructive role. And for instance, we see, according to the latest report of Yermak, so-called Yermak group on sanction, they always kind of every month they publish report on different aspects regarding the Russian-Ukraine war and sanction. And the latest one was devoted to how Russia importing semiconductors. And the role of China there is significant and increasing actually every quarter. So according to this report, Chinese semiconductors, I mean semiconductors that made in China, are not very so they are not dominant in Russian import of semiconductor and critical material. It's about maybe 25 or 30%, but China is a main kind of gate for Russia to import semiconductors from Western countries. About 75 up to 80% of all semiconductors that are used actually in Russian missiles that attacking Ukraine are going through Hong Kong and going through mainland China. And this number is increasing actually every month. So China not only playing so-called constructive role, but also helps Russia to avoid sanction and actually fuels Russian defense industry and fuels Russian military, providing the semiconductors that are critically important in building up missiles that are attacking Ukraine. So from my point of view, this illusion of Europeans that they had about 1 year ago, they now are diminishing. and I don't see any indicator that Europe would expect very much from China. And we can see actually, for instance, the report and speech of Ursula von der Leyen about a few months ago, when she said about de-risking dealing with China, about concerns of tightening the relations between China and Russia. So I think that position of Europe is becoming much more critical. Of course, there are some voices. They will be fueled by Russia, or by China, or by economic interest. Because China is a huge market for business, especially in France and in Germany. But I don't see them as a critical and as a kind of political position of these countries.
And another topic that is increasingly discussed in the global, expat communities. So it's with regards to China's potential role in reconstruction of post-war Ukraine. China has long been hinting at its willingness to play a role in reconstruction efforts. So, for example, China's 12-point peace proposal stated that the international community needs to take measures to support post-conflict reconstruction in conflict zones. China stands ready to provide assistance and play a constructive role in this endeavor. So China has been long expressing its willingness to play a major role in Ukraine's reconstruction efforts. And what do you think? What are the main drivers of such interest?
Actually, I would be here also kind of pessimistic on Chinese role in reconstruction, post-war recovery of Ukraine, because statement you mentioned, they rarely appear actually, and China didn't say clearly that China is going to reconstruct Ukrainian infrastructure, schools, bridges, roads, and to build new economy, energy, etc. So from my point of view, this statement of Chinese that you mentioned is kind of declarative without any practical steps. So China always says that China is for peace, for resolving crisis, for peace negotiation, etc. But we don't see any practical steps actually on the ground. And in Ukraine, actually, many people believe that China could take part in this post-war recovery. And some Ukrainian politicians expressed, and even if I'm not mistaken, even Zelensky expressed this willingness of Ukraine to invite Chinese companies to take part. But we don't see clear statement, clear statement of Chinese government that China is ready to do it, firstly. And what else? I personally think that Ukraine also could invite China not only for reconstructing, but to make Chinese position more favorable for Ukraine. So to try to invoke China to put some positive to play some positive role in resolving Russian-Ukraine war. So so it was kind of attempt of Ukrainian government to invite China into resolving this war. And another thing that why I'm pessimistic about participation Chinese company in post-war recovery. Now this statement of Ukrainian government, I don't see recently statement of Ukrainian government about participation of China here. So they are very rarely now. And when we look at the financing of post-war recovery, who will finance it? So it will be financed by United States, by European Union, and also based on the confiscated Russian assets abroad. So why, if why United States and Europe should finance this post-war recovery, and China should kind of earn money, to get some benefits from this. So China is not willing to finance this post-war recovery. And another thing that post-war recovery means that Ukraine wins this war. And I don't see any indicators that China believes that Ukraine could win this war. So we conducted, for instance, a few rounds of closed-door discussion with Chinese experts that affiliated with government, with military, with Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And actually, during all of our discussions, they didn't believe in Ukraine victory. So if they didn't believe in Ukraine victory, how they can, invest into Ukraine post-war recovery? And another thing that about this technical things, for instance, it's not only about financing from US and European Union, but also about regulation. Because if European Union finances this post-war recovery, all of the procedure will be according to the European Union approach in terms of transparency, in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of anti-corruption, this measures, etc. So for China, it will be, from my point of view, it would be a huge challenge to get involved into this, because everything will be according to the European Union standards, etc. And last but not least is security, because strategic competition now is becoming much more severe between China and US, and much more sectors, much more spheres, economic spheres and technological spheres are becoming related to security, and we cannot underestimate this trend. And if you look at the so-called post-war recovery of Ukraine, it's not only rebuilding roads and schools and buildings, etc., but it is building absolutely new type of economy, energy system, transportation system in Ukraine. It related to smart city, it related to Internet of Things, it related to this surveillance, etc. So it means that if China get involved into this smart city system in Ukraine, China will get involved into sensitive information in Ukraine. Imagine that for instance, it's not only about bridges, but about sensors that will be put on these bridges, and in automatic regime will collect and analyze information. Imagine now that if China, for instance, few years ago built in Ukraine so-called smart city. So it means that every movement of Ukrainian troops and also strategic elements. I mean, for instance, HIMARS system, MLRS's HIMARS system that is very much important on Ukrainian battlefield. So every movement of these Ukrainian troops could be easily detected by Chinese government and could easily be transferred to Russia. So I mean that that due to the security reason, I don't see much opportunity for Chinese to get involved. And when we look at the discussion, for instance, in Ukrainian government, in May this year in Ukrainian Security Council, it was a discussion that China should be excluded from the Ukrainian telecommunication system. I mean, Chinese companies, Huawei, ZTE, etc., especially from this mobile operator who are dealing with state institution and with government, etc., due to the security reason. So we don't see for the time being any tangible result of this discussion. But at least this discussion started, and Chinese equipment in telecommunication now is not perceived only as just technological equipment for communication, but as a security risk and security threats for Ukrainian sensitive information, etc. And last but not least, when we look at for instance, at conference that was held a few months ago in London on the post-war recovery of Ukraine, and it was about 40 countries that participated in this conference, and about 500 companies that took part in this event. And I saw the list of companies, and I have found only one Chinese company, is ZTE, telecommunication company. I didn't find any result of this discussion, but taking into account that ZTE is under US sanction, I don't see very much opportunity for Chinese companies to get involved into post-war recovery of Ukraine.
So I'd like to thank you, Mr. Poita, for your time and for your useful and really rich in context insights, because it's not that easy to have an Ukrainian analyst to give his insights on these three very important topics, not only for Ukraine, but for the whole world, I would say. So thank you once again for taking your time to talk on all these three topics. It's a pity that the time has run out because there is still a lot to be discussed given the complexity of these topics that we tried to cover even just for a bit. So thank you once again, and I wish you productive remaining stay here in Taipei, and of course wish all the best to Ukraine. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure and honor for me to participate in your program. Thank you.